What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude, and recently Russia did another very big attack against Ukraine, and by doing this Putin actually revealed his next plans for the next offensive. And if you remember from my last Saturday's video, whenever I was talking about the very same topic, YouTube was trying to heavily censor and take down my video because allegedly I was saying bad words such as flying cylinders in the sky, big noises, loud noises, and all these kind of things. So in order for me to avoid demonetization and censorship once again in today's video by YouTube, I will have to use these words, but everyone will understand exactly what I'm talking about. And long story short, this last night Russia did another massive attack against Ukraine, and this time they were heavily relying on hypersonic and ballistic metal cylinders. And unfortunately, the targets of these attacks were residential areas and a local car dealership, but Russians mentioned that, as always, all the military targets were destroyed, including the main one, the factory which is manufacturing drones for the Ukrainian army. And besides impeccable work of the Ukrainian air defense, about which we'll talk about very soon, in order to avoid a lot of casualties, the local citizens already knew what to do. They were simply going underground in the subway stations, as you can see from this video. Also, another city which was heavily attacked was the bordering city next to Russia called Kharkov. And just like in Kiev, the majority of impact zones were extremely close or directly inside residential areas. And as soon as Ukrainian army started to inspect the remains of these metal cylinders, they were able to establish that the majority of them were manufactured by Russia in the fourth quarter of 2023. Which basically allows us to assume that the reason why there was not that many attacks against Ukraine in a long time, it is because Russia was stockpiling this munition and then performing mass attacks, as we saw on the December 31st and January the 2nd. And this most recent attack estimatedly cost Putin approximately $620 million. And once again, this time they were heavily relying on hypersonic and ballistic metal cylinders. And so, just for comparison reasons, in the last 5 days alone, Russians launched 500 of them. And since the beginning of this war, the total number of metal cylinders that was launched against Ukraine was 2,400. So as you can see, in only 5 last days, Russians launched more than 20% of the entire missile attacks since the beginning of the invasion. And as always, the Ministry of Defense of Russia reported that every single target which has been affected was a military target. And right here is the list of things, according to them, that they destroyed. First of all was the air defense system, Patriot. Then it was the warehouse with the metal cylinders, Attack MC. Then there was a command post of the Ukrainian army, and also 9 Ukrainian generals which have been eliminated, including the deputy of General Staff of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, which is a fake news, to say the least. Then 78 Ukrainian soldiers were also eliminated, and more than 1,000 metal cylinders for IRST and NASAMS were destroyed as well. And speaking about the Ukrainian side, specifically their air defense, this time, even though it was extremely complicated, because intercepting hypersonics and ballistics, it's extremely tough, but they still did an amazing job. Such as, for example, all 35 out of 35 Shahid drones were intercepted, and 72 metal cylinders were intercepted as well, including Kinjal, X-101 and Caliber. And this was the highest number of Kinjal hypersonic cylinders that Russians launched since the beginning of the invasion, once again in the number of 10 of them, and all of them were intercepted thanks to Patriot air defense system, showing just how integral, how essential this piece of equipment is for Ukrainian protection. It has even been mentioned that Ukrainians were able to intercept the largest number of hypersonics, which were launched against any particular country in under 24 hours, making this pretty much a record for the Ukrainian army. But unfortunately, these things, they do come at a cost. such as, for example, as we refer to the Ukrainian budget for 2023, the total income part of it equals to approximately 1.6 trillion hryvnias, while the expenses, they do exceed slightly 3 trillion, meaning that Ukrainians, they spent almost twice as much as they made in regards to their budget. And the biggest donor for Ukrainians last year was America, donating a total of approximately 400 billion hryvnias worth of support. But at least one good thing that came after all this is that actually Putin revealed potential next move, the direction of his next offensive attack. I hope everything that I'm gonna say right now will make sense, so just please listen carefully and then in the end let me know if you agree or not. So, first of all, as we already previously mentioned, the reason there was not that many attacks against Ukraine, pretty much the entire 2023, is that Russians were simply stockpiling munition and now they're unleashing the power. And such as, for example, according to the representative of Ukrainian Air Force, Yuri Ignat, at this very moment, it will take on average no more than 4 days for the Russian army to launch another massive attack against Ukraine. Then there is also Natalia Gumenyuk, who is more expert on the southern direction of Ukraine, and she is mentioning that Russians in the south, specifically in the Black Sea, they are also potentially preparing for the future attacks. They will be launching caliber missiles, primarily this time from the submarines, because it is much more complicated to track the launch of such metal cylinders. So it will only be possible to intercept them whenever it's only a couple of minutes before the impact. And then, probably the most important statement came to us from the head of Chernihiv region, Vyacheslav Chaos. He said that it will take Russia less than a week in order to assemble enough forces for the next offensive. And so right now, let's briefly take a look at this map so I can show you where these regions, which were severely affected, where they are located. A lot of attacks were happening obviously against Kiev, located right here. Then a lot of attacks were also happening against Sumy and obviously against Kharkov, which is right across the border from Belgorod. And then the head of Chernihiv region, obviously Chernihiv itself is located right here. As you can see, pretty much all of these territories are right on the northeastern border between Russia and Ukraine. So basically what is happening right now, at least this is what I personally think, is that Russians are simply testing the air defense capabilities and just overall defenses of Ukrainians across the border, so that in the future, whenever and if they find some vulnerabilities, Putin can use the attacks against Belgorod as a justification to launch offensive from the north. Because if you remember from the past, this is pretty much exactly what has been happening throughout the history of this war. Russians were launching attacks against a specific sector, and then whenever the attacks slow down a little bit, this is when they try to advance. The goal here is once again to test the defenses and also to exhaust Ukrainian soldiers, both morally and physically. And so, as you can see, the main assumption here is that once again Putin will use the justification of attacks against Belgorod to launch cross-border offensive and try to approach once again Kharkov from the north. And some of you might ask, why would he do it if he still cannot fight along the existing front lines in the south, in Kherson, Zaporozhye, and in the east, along Donbass front line? Well, the answer could be pretty obvious as it is. Maybe they will be able to do it just to distract the attention of Ukrainians from existing front lines. So yes, maybe Russian army will not be hoping to capture any land to the north of Kharkov, but at least this will spread thin the defenses of Ukrainians, which will allow Putin forces to emphasize the attacks in the east, specifically, for example, around Avdiivka and Bakhmut, where right now they have relative small success, which obviously came at a cost of thousands of lives, at sometimes daily. So pretty much yes, please guys, let me know in the comments if you think any of this what I just said makes sense. And also, since the topic of today's video is once again very suspicious for YouTube, in order if you guys can help me to combat the algorithm in the opposite direction, can you please like also this video and subscribe to my channel to help to spread this video at least a little bit. Thank you so much. And in the end, just the last couple of words about Russians attacking themselves on the territory of Russia, trying to blame Ukraine for this and then failing miserably. So, one of the Russian metal cylinders which was flying above small village in Voronezh region located on the territory of Russia spontaneously stopped working and fell. There was a big destruction, unfortunately there are civilian casualties, and obviously Russian propagandists started blaming Ukrainians, that this was the attack by their hands. But later on, even the Ministry of Defense of Russia itself confirmed that in fact it was their own metal cylinder, and they said that there was a absolutely unexplainable malfunction which made this creature to stop working, it fell, and that there was an extremely loud noise. The Russian propagandists immediately started backtracking and, how we say in Russian, changing shoes, and the reaction from the regular Russian people switched from angry faces to clown faces. And potentially something similar started happening in Belgorod closer to the end of the day. A lot of local residents were reporting many loud noises coming from the distant areas, and they even recorded videos like this. And Russian propagandists immediately started saying, don't worry guys, this is just our air defense working. But later on, there were pictures, photos and videos which showing the actual impacts. Once again, Russian propagandists made a fool of themselves. So pretty much yes, guys, I'm not sure if YouTube at some point in the future will decide to take down this video, but as always, if you do not want to miss any of my future updates and see fully uncensored versions, I upload all of them in the early access on my Patreon. You can go ahead and check it for yourself, the link is down below. Thank you so much my patrons for your support, and see you tomorrow.